Greetings, everybody out there in Dreamland. I say salam, iron sharpens iron, and a friend sharpens a friend. Each and every single one of you tuning into the broadcast of the Beyond Top Secret Texas broadcast by Tex, your host, broadcasting to you from the third coast, the coast most, the Gulf Coast of Texas. Thank each and every single one of you for tuning in. This is your first episode. This is your 400th episode. Thank you. We're going to be speaking about the true history of mankind. We're going to be covering very controversial, heretical, alternative understandings of the history of mankind through the biblical chronologies and the narratives relating to the Hebrew and Israelite peoples and their journeys. From this, not to over-exaggerate their importance, but from a clearly anthropological view, it provides a surprisingly gestalt, complete history of the ancient world through their stories, legends, metaphors, etc. And this is simultaneously shared with the various mythological origins or mythological inheritances of, say, the Greeks or the Popovo Mayans or the Muslims or the Buddhists or the Hindus, etc. This is the consensus of all of these ancient and most ancient societies with written language, the consensus of a version of reality. And while history can never truly, accurately be retold, it can be summarized more accurately than incorrectly. That is what I'm trying to do here with this multi-part series that I call the Tex Saga. Revealed to me in Revelation by the Supreme Being, Allah. This is the history of the truth of the Western biblical ancient American lands, fundamentally altering perceptions of all things by changing the settings from the Eastern Hemisphere and the conventionally recognized settings of North Africa, the Middle East, the Mediterranean, in Europe as being the lands of the Bible, or the Old Testament, or New Testament, however you would like to differentiate that or specify that, the Quran, the traditions of the Abrahamic religions that are integral to understanding the secular histories of the world. Integral, although there is scant archaeological evidence for anything to actually be proven verified as to having occurred where they say it has occurred. There is very little evidence for Exodus. There is very little evidence for the life of Jesus Christ. There is very little evidence for the city of Jerusalem before they started archaeologically discovering it in the 1800s, for example, and even then it was very scarce. Very little, for example, remains of anything of the foundations of the temple, whatever, what have you. And there's a lot of controversy as to the locations of things, such as the Temple of Solomon, or specific, holy sites that are oftentimes the center of attention for pilgrimages. All of that basically was arbitrarily designated. If you look at conventional history, even from an atheistic secularist point, that was artificially mapped out, or at least codified, and the locations that they were in many, many years later, many decades later, specifically by Constantine's wife, the Emperor Constantine's wife, when they relocated the capital of Rome into the Eastern Roman Empire's capital, Constantinople, the city of Constantinople. When they moved the Eastern Roman Empire, when they split the Roman Empire into two functionally independent sister empires, the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire's capital was in Spain. And the Eastern was in present-day Turkey, which was called Byzantium at the time, and it was Constantinople, which is now Istanbul. They had to integrate themselves with the locals, specifically the hostile former dominant tribes and powers, what we would call the Arabic, Palestinian, Semitic populations. But they're not true Semitic populations if you actually listen to the presentation. Semitic populations, Native Americans, but the peoples that of Palestine, etc. And originally this was who were these desert tribes, typically of merchants and various other kingdoms like Persia, formerly of Persia, Seleucid Empire, the many different caravan tribes, and a way to codify it is, their new empire based on their new present religion of a Jewish Messiah. This is, like I said, I cringe when I say that because it wasn't at the time even possible. There were no Jews at the time. A local Messiah, a Palestinian Messiah, a more accurate translation would be an Aramaic Messiah. To be honest, the Jewish Messiah came in much, much later, into the time of Zionism around the 19th century, around the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries. That's how late in the game this historical creation of Christ has been, as well as how late in history, how recent in history the creation of evangelical fundamental Christianity is, which is actually a smokescreen for the pushing of a Middle Eastern, specifically quote-unquote Israeli setting for not only all three major Abrahamic religions, but also orientation for the ancient histories of all society, all civilization. Literally putting themselves artificially, forging the history to put themselves into the center of a forged world's history. The truth of the matter is that the three major cities of Jerusalem, of Babylon, and of Rome were originally in North America. And you can say overall, even larger scale, the Western Hemisphere, including the Incas and the Viracocha on the Pacific coast of South America. This is not even drawing back to even older, previous ages, where histories and timelines played out until their reset, or cataclysmic epoch ending. You can check back. Each episode I've done covers one of these ages, as they are understood chronologically as having occurred, conventionally speaking. I'm not even trying to add in Apocrypha like Enoch, etc. Conventionally speaking, through the books of Genesis, and the present-day Old Testament, up to the New Testament, etc. And then present-day biblical text that you could find in any hotel dresser drawer. Check your bookshelf. You probably got King James Version or something like that, Gideon's or something, and you can kind of keep along, go online. See, that's the thing. I don't want to really flex. I don't want to be like, oh, in the book of Jashir and the book of Enoch, and like I've used Life Adam Eve, I've used the Apocrypha before. Everybody go Gnostic, and I've tried to use other texts like the Quran and the Vedas and Hinduism, etc. Sparingly, but I need to use them sometimes when describing the worldview of these ancient cultures, because these cultures are the ones that actually have the written history. You know, because if you actually think of the Western history, Latin, English specifically, there are no ancient texts in English. Everything either must be translated from Greek to a European Latin, language, a Mediterranean language, or European language. And the only way, conventionally speaking, through modern day history, as you can find in Wikipedia or any college, the only ancient texts that were recovered and saved from antiquity were those that were in Muslim, Middle Eastern libraries. Muslim scholars translated and saved all of the knowledge of the ancient Greeks, all of the knowledge of the ancient Romans, all of the knowledge of the ancient Carthaginians, all of the knowledge of the ancient Middle Eastern, Persian, Babylonian, Egyptian empires and dynasties. And they did so during the Caliphate. This information was literally only transported to Europe after the ending of the Crusades and a cooling off of a war that lasted for almost 800 years. Called the Reconquista. Oh, sorry, not 800 years. Was it 80 generations? So a war that lasted for 80 generations. Called the Reconquista. 80 generations. In attempting to liberate Spain, the Western Roman Empire, as well as battling in the Eastern Roman Empire, the Northern African Moors, newly united with a monotheistic religion known as Islam. From this, we can get a lot of vagary. We can get a lot of room to illustrate and to be very suspicious as to the chronologies as they have been presented. You can say this is a stretch, but for example, what we know as consented, academic established reality when it comes to ancient mythologies and legends can be sometimes only confirmed by one or two sources, sometimes hundreds of years apart. The Prometheus myth, for example, has only two verifiable historic sources: the Greek poet Aeschylus and the Roman poet Ovid. These men lived 450 years apart. There are only two ancient documents. There are only two ancient documents that can verifiably say to contain the myth of Prometheus, which is one of the most well-known, widely retold ancient myths of Greek and Roman mythology. The story of stealing fire from heaven and delivering it as a gift to mankind for which this god is punished for eternity for defying Zeus, the king of the gods. It would even be said to serve as the basis for the myth of Lucifer, as we're going to get to. But until one sees that, even by academic standards, it has two verifiable sources that are 450 years apart, that could easily have been forged, or intentionally translated, or accredited as such. And because of their rarity, they are basically off limits to the public, behind a lock and key, and treated with the utmost security. This is like secret Vatican library level shadiness when it comes to European history. That they will tell you that they know the answers as to why they're right. But if you want to check yourself, well, they won't translate for you, and they will keep those books intentionally locked away in private libraries, like the Vatican Library, with intentionally intense security. Because I believe the truth will paint a different picture. What is actually verifiable in these works, in these pedigrees, in these city histories, in these ledgers, in these poetics, in these dramas, in these written word accounts, right? In these books, for lack of a better word, these maps, etc., is the truth that all of these nations were but struggling colonies on the coast of Europe, the Mediterranean, the Middle East, and Africa. Colonies of Atlantean survivors who, because of Europe's very difficult terrain, made very little progress developing an infrastructure in the interior, and rather devolved as their eccentric cults of priests gained mythic godlike standards, or standards of worship, or becoming false idols in themselves, like Dionysus, etc. Devolved into astro-theologically governed pagan, what we know as pagan, mini-idol, syncretic cults of slave traders, baby sacrificers, human sacrificers of all kind, cannibals, ritualistic cannibals, ancient mystery worshippers, as astro-theologians, what we know is all different types of black magic, left-hand path, shit, as well as war cults on top of war cults, to the point that we get the truth of the matter, that these people who were the Phoenicians, who were the Romans, who were the ancient Greeks, were absolute savages, all descended from Atlanteans, mind you. And their worst vices were all inherited from Atlantis, made even the more perverse through separation and the extreme energetic landscape of Europe. It's in the mythology itself if you don't have eyes to read. For example, the founding of Rome by two twins cast out into the wilderness as babes, sucklings, but who were given mercy by wild she-wolf. And this wild she-wolf raised these children as its own. And as they got stronger, they developed a city for outcasts, pirates, runaway slaves, etc. And the city would be known as Rome, the city on 7 hills. But as it was prophesied, and as it came to pass, the twins grew competitive, ambitious, and once again violently evil, with one brother killing the other brother for total control of Rome. Rome's history is further detailed as being a society that was mostly men, mostly young pirates, brigands, soldiers, sailors, craftsmen, merchants, etc. It was a city of very masculine energy that worshipped and upheld the rights of men as equals, as patriarchs. But it had very few women because it wasn't a natural community. It was a city made by mostly all male survivors, outcasts, or intentional exiles like prisoners or pirates, sailors, etc. To secure women, In this mythology that's conventionally accepted, they threw a games, a day of sports, and invited locals from communities elsewhere, fishing villages, other survivors, other colonists, to come and watch the sporting events that they would throw. Boxing, wrestling, different ball games, races, etc. It was all advertised. And as people gathered for the festivities in good nature, in good faith, families appeared with their daughters, men appeared with their wives. They were lured into a false sense of security by this community of mostly men who they trusted, maybe out of naivety, maybe out of a sense of loyalty to what these men formerly represented. For example, if these men were soldiers or sailors for the military, that would have been impressive enough to keep an old world sense of respect. Imagine, after a great disaster or event, in the rubble as you rebuild your life, a group of soldiers who have been living a few miles away, who you have known about, traded with. These men invite you to see some games, a day of festivities, to have a party with them. You bring your wife, you bring your daughter, you bring your family. And these soldiers welcome you, get you a little drunk, start entertaining you with their games, until they decide and surprise you with an ambush, overpowering your men, stealing your women, taking them as their own. Because that's the history of Rome. The patron god of Rome was Mars, a red-colored god of war. Rome's color was red. The children of the Lilith race, red hair, red paint. People of Adama, red paint. You see this presentation of red again and again and again for the ancient world. Atlanteus, the red. Association with red. The Phoenicians, red. Who would become the Irish? The red. Eric the Red, the Rus, Russia, the red. You would get this truth in plain sight type retelling for Egypt. You get the truth in plain sight retelling for the Middle East. You get the truth in plain sight retelling for North Africa, for all of this stuff, because no matter how much they try to say they know for certain how ancient their societies are, they still either are discovering, trying to locate, or damn near have given up ever finding these supposedly iconic, famous historical places. In fact, Atlantis, most famously, will never be discovered. And all signs of it point to America. Most likely like the Bimini Road in the Caribbean, which we'll talk about. But in this area of the Tex Saga, we have Europe in these earliest colonial stages developing. And they have already existed. Remember, I said that they were the survivors of the old age. I brought us up to speed with Daniel and the other Semitics, whoever's representing this tribe of Daniel. He who speaks with God, the God speakers, the people who communicate directly for God, who speaks for God, the messengers, quote unquote, the people who take visions, the vision questers of the Semitic tribes, the people who most intentionally get bit by snakes, given that they have this serpent worship, Quetzalcoatl. They are released. They split up into the two different camps. One is a camp that has identities with Central Mexico, with the Mexicanite people. The others return to their Semitic roots in Yosemite, in the Yosemite area, Zion, California, etc. In fact, Zion, as it's created, represents their oceanic deity, Poseidon. This was a deity that was shared all over the world. There is no confusion, for example, of the Dagon worship present in the Old Testament, such as in the retelling of the story of Samson, which I can get into in greater details. I think I'm going to get into all these stories in greater details one by one. Well, for the sake of chronology, understand that Poseidon, Dagon, ocean god worship was universal on all coastal civilizations. And no doubt there were internal land-based water deities for lakes and rivers as well. Zion National Park, for example, still has many waterfalls and rivers that were given ceremonially religious names, like the Three Marys, meaning the Three Virgin Marys. So we have them there. We have as we go down south to the Mojave, to the deserts of America, the Israeli 12 tribes, which formerly fled the invasion of Babylon to survive and found themselves in the desert, as if they're punished for their cowardice in fleeing from defending their city, having to survive in the harsh desert climates as groups of warring tribes that we would then now know as the Comanche, the Apache, the Navajo, etc., etc., etc. These men were brave, excellent, fierce warriors, some of the strongest warriors of all human history. And that was a legacy of these people's original tenacity and experience in total warfare from their exodus is almost completely full circle across the North American continent. And down south, where Tenoctitlan/Jerusalem still currently is, although ravaged, set back quite a large way in terms of damage, in terms of depopulation, in terms of destruction after its invasion. The temple has been emptied, the relics have been looted. It's basically just bedrock foundation and the shells of burned out buildings, with a lot of like raiders and scavengers, etc., poor peasants, etc., the people who have come in from the outside, literally streets with dragons in them and stuff like that. This city is recovered and rebuilt, even though it's presumed cursed, by the people of this former, group that more closely identify with the natives, aka the native tribes of the area, people we would know as Canaanites, people who we now know as Mexicans, and the various tribes, the different dozens and dozens of tribes that each numbered in the millions, or that altogether numbered in the millions, but whose real identities and separations and uniqueness has mostly been lost to time. These are the people, for example, who prefer to live mostly in a semi-forested or foraging environment or habitat, only using the structures for shelters during storms or, for mass gatherings or for, storage, etc., of even goods. And preferring to sleep, though, in their own camps as the jungle, etc., was taking back these cities and these ruins at an accelerated pace. So we're seeing these people, although they returned, not fully rebuilding, but merely resuming their former lives in these now new ruins. And this is, and then of course there is Babylon, and Babylon is what we would know as the groups of the Cherokee, or the groups of the 12 turtle nations, the 12 tribes, the 12 turtle nations of the east of the Appalachians, of the Ohio River Valley, of the Mississippi River Valley, etc. That are living in these cities that are hundreds of years old already by this time, the mound builders, the people who are living on the East Coast in longhouses with farms, with roads, with wine cellars, with full-on, infrastructure, with communities that have multi-racial castes of people in them, including redskin, including white-skinned, red-haired, ruling classes. These people are also fully aware of Europe, they're fully aware of the world. There is no lag, there is no dark age here. And although they are declining, it is still the most dominant superpower, if there are superpowers to be spoken of in this world. It is one of the most unified cultures still, the most advanced society at the end of all of this. They are the ones that begin to have a downfall, a downward spiral of a societal collapse that is still mostly mysterious, but is indicative of plague, of famine, of combinations of that and war, civil war, with the environment being much like it was described at the very end of the book of Daniel, where kings are being assassinated, and then the generals that assassinated the kings are being killed literally that night themselves. Kings are being literally stabbed in the back, and you go through a cycle of 2 or 3 kings a year type thing. The society of Babylon quickly becomes one of unspoken rules of separation, separate but equal type lifestyles in between the tribes, strict treaties involving territory, involving the refusal of trespass for hunting rights, etc. Remember, the people who are red-haired, the people who are the Lilith spawn, they are the ones who are most akin to hunting. Their entire society will be based on hunting. Everywhere they go is always hunting, based, idealism. It's a hunting-based society. They're literally the hunters in all of the astrotheological, the Sagittarius or the Aries type zodiacs as well. And that's their house, etc. When it comes to this divide. So they would quickly flee and leave their cities as well as the society collapsed, mostly due to disease. They would turn to a lifestyle that we would recognize as one of being extreme self-isolation between unrelated or untrusted tribes, as well as pure self-sustaining, off-the-grid paleo lifestyleism. This seems as if though they were primitive, but they were not primitive. Imagine if a bunch of modern people with crossbows and compound bows and arrows, etc., with camo clothing, with camping gear, tents, they took their women, they took their children, they took their dogs, in their hunting clubs, in their communities, in their neighborhoods. They said, peace, we're out of here, we're not sticking around towns where people are getting sick, we're not sticking around where there's no farming, where there's no food because everyone's too sick to work, and people are just resorting to crime and getting desperate, and it's sad. Obviously this has been cursed by something. And no doubt the weather was a huge factor. No doubt there were other things, other factors adding in. For example, there were gigantic floods around the 1200 AD. No doubt that could have factored in. There were seasons of dark ages due to volcanic activities. No doubt that factored in. And there might have been even weirder acts of high strangeness that were taken as omens by a very sensitive and religious peoples. Raining fish, total eclipses, earthquakes, for example, tidal waves, fires, meteor showers. People feared comets, for example, very much back then, because comets were thought to bring disease. And the people were very astrotheological. They were very superstitious. If you don't believe that a society that is mostly based on astrology, not astronomy, astrology, would not disintegrate if there were events that caused the night sky to radically change, if there were events to cause the signs in heaven to radically change so much so they have to change the calendar to account for extra months. The calendar would go from 8 months to 10 months to 12 months. As much as you would think these people would be able to roll with it and adapt, no doubt there was a large amount of chaos and confusion where people were more likely willing to abandon their former masters rather than try to make sense of why they were wrong. This decline of Babylon would have been like the decline of the United States of America in present day. If there were foreigners or foreign colonies of Americans, say military bases, say with militaries, the Army, for example, in Ramstein in Germany, or Guam or Hawaii, for example, Pearl Harbor, there are all these navies in Pearl Harbor, from mainland America, how, realistically, in modern day, at what point do you think the communications would break down enough for these people to go independent and use the resources not as United States government property, or maybe even thinking of themselves as the only chance, the only chance that this country can survive? Say, perfect example, hypothetically, you have Pearl Harbor with all its Navy, and think about all the Army bases and Marines, etc., that live in Hawaii, right? And the United States is going through the shit. It's going through a collapse. There's riots on the news every day in the big cities. There's spotty infrastructure. People aren't getting gasoline anymore. People are in the hundreds of thousands or millions reported to simply be running into the woods. Simply be they're armed to the teeth separatists who are forming tribes based on relationships with each other, like blood relationships, family relationships, race relationships, etc., running into the woods and forming extremist separatist groups in every city, in almost every forest. Right? You have this going on. Think about how much shit you would be suffering if there was a plague, or not in Hawaii, mind you, you're on an island. But there's rates like 5 out of every other person, like 1 out of every 3, 1 out of every 4 people is dying, and the rate of infection in the conventional history of smallpox, which I think this was based on, for example, was 75%. There was an estimated 100 million people in the Native American population of North America before the discoveries of North America by Europe. After the discovery of North America by Europeans, by Christopher Columbus on the Caribbean. Disease spread like wildfire to the point that 75 million out of that 100 million died within the first century. Meaning that if it happened in 1492 when Europe discovered America, it happened, let's say 1500, that by 1600, that from 1500, from Cortez landing and taking over to Tenochtitlan, naming it Mexico City, kidnapping Montezuma and killing him, from 1500 to 1600, by the time the British got their first colony, 75% of all Native Americans were dead and gone. Only 25 million lived in their shadow. That's 3 out of 4 were dead by disease alone. Not to mention the subsequent famine, malnutrition, violence, suicide, etc., etc., etc. By having your entire population, your entire people, annihilated at the ratio of 3 to 4. Imagine if 3 out of 4 Americans died. If 3 out of 4 Americans died, how many Americans would die currently right now in this population? Let me just get my calculator out. Hold on 1 second. Let's get this calculator up. Calculator 3, 4 Americans. So we got 300 million Americans roughly, right? Is that 300 million Americans? Times 0.75. So 225 million Americans would die from this scenario. Think about it. If you're a military commander in Hawaii with the top clearance and authority over all of the military troops in Hawaii, at what point, after 225 million former Americans are dead and gone, would you order your men to take those weapons, to take those ships, to take their training and cannons, and return to their former homeland, America, to take over whatever is left under martial law, and to set up a new nation in your likeness? How you want to set it up. In its name, in its old name, you will set up a new nation. You can easily see that as a scenario that played out, the one that I'm describing now, after the hundreds of years of collapse that occurred, within a very, very I would say, with all of that collapse that occurred, not with over 100 years, not over hundreds and hundreds of years, but simply over a few hundred years. And remember, I said they took away a century, they took away 1,000 years, they took away like about 400 years of Roman history. They added 1,000 years to general European history, padding it out to try to explain the interior nations like the French or the Swedes and by the Gauls, etc., like that. Try to create all this mythology around Egypt, ancient Egypt. They try to create all this mythology around Middle East, Cyprus and Euphrates, Iraq, Babylon, etc., Petra, all that shit. They try to create the mythologies of Asia, which is also going on at this time. There are Asian colonies too, by the way. They don't factor into any of this, really. So they started in the lands of Mu. They were colonies out there in the lands of Mu. So Indonesia, Vietnam, Indochina, China itself, southern China, Japan, they all have their seedling colonies. They all have their empires being built at this time too. Only China, I believe, would actually come and try to colonize back again, but then they would only really hit the coast up and use a few of the established ports of the ruins, etc., of Mu. That was around the 1400s, so traditionally. So if you do the math, it's either accurate around the 1400s before the Spanish showed up, which I'm going to be talking about intensely going forward now, is Reconquista of Cristo Rey, as well as the symbolism present in all of this to the development of Jesus Christ, the Catholic Church. As we're moving through history, they are writing the books. To understand Europe at its points, one has to understand that they're all related Atlantean cults, as I've established before. And as they were fighting, they were all on the same occult pages symbolically about rights for authority based on their ritualistic power in these covens and satanic, but what we would know as black magic, astrotheological disciplines, right? What we would know as Isis worship, Ra worship, Saturn worship, These are the actual astrotheological cults that worship certain celestial bodies as influential to all of time and space. For example, Ra, they believed, was the centermost Polaris star, the northern star, which they believed oriented and was the highest point of all the sky, and thus all of creation. Things like this, the gods are the highest of the high, the stars above God, or, to go above the stars of God. The stars of God, the theological ceiling, the vault of heaven. It's 100% the same sky we see today, except for we have been taught to see it wrong. The sun's pattern of movement is an ellipse, because the sun's pattern movement, as presented in our sky, is based on a wobbling and oscillating movement of our axis as we orbit it. It produces basically either a three or a two intersection, three portioned ellipsis, or a figure 8 ellipsis with one intersection, depending on certain events in the Earth's rotational cycle. Over Europe, the sun was traced by the heliocentric solar cults of Ra and Apollo, and it was traced as to this ellipsis onto which parts of the landmass it covered. There were all major cities were founded and created under the occult or astrotheological tracing of this ellipsis of the sun's orbit. At the very northern extreme is London, thus the UK. In the intersection is Rome, thus Italy. And at the very southern is the current spot for, some people will say Jerusalem, but I say Cairo, Egypt. Or interpreted Mecca. I said I'm not 100% written in stone, it has to be this way, but there is a southern point that is contested either between Cairo, Egypt, where Mecca currently is in Saudi Arabia, or in Jerusalem, where it is said to exist in Israel. But I don't believe Jerusalem existed at any point in history. This is why I say it's controversial. I do believe that Alexandria, Egypt, Thebes, Memphis, and Cairo were colonies that were established on the Nile. They could have been them. And I do believe that there were no doubt ancient desert cities established as well, tracing on this heliocentric path. My suspicions are most likely the zenith is where the Kaaba is, where the black stone of the Kaaba is founded. This gives the three key power centers in the new Eastern world, intentionally founded to be these power cities, by the way, these cities that harness the celestial power of the sun. London, Rome, where the Vatican is, and Mecca, the spiritual center of Islam. This is a key to their unity, for under it all, there is only one world order amongst these three separate world powers. The City of London is finances and trade. The Vatican, spiritual power and history with the Vatican libraries. In fact, you could even say the progress of science through their many Vatican astronomers and the investments into astronomy. The astrotheologians became astronomers. The astrologers became the astronomers of the modern world through the Renaissance, etc., through the transformation of the Renaissance. And then, of course, the spiritual anchor of the black stone Saturn in the seemingly timeless, primordial Mecca of modern-day Islam. The one world system is nothing new. In fact, in Europe, it was first created and founded by the legendary hero Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great was the archetype of a living hero who symbolically was immortalized through the archetypical Mithras, and the actions of the archetypical legendary Mithras, the Mithraic cult of the avatar of the sun, injustice through violence, literally the embodiment of the Aryan Atlantean man, slaughtering the black bull of fear and space and time, the ox, the Onax, drinking its blood in a vampiric ritual act and gaining its mana to control time, to control destiny as interpreted by controlling time, through the founding of its centers of power, through its populations of worshippers, and through its temples on the zenith points of the course of the sun itself. These Mithric cults would have a hero they would intentionally breed and raise, this Alexander the Great. Born from a queen who was a serpent worshipper, who was witnessed in sexual congress with serpents upon the time of conception of Alexander the Great, and raised by the warrior king Philip II, surrounded by the secret society of the heliocentric Hermes Trismegistus Ra-worshipping cult of Amen, he would be set forth on a ritualistic conquest, first against the enemies of his family line, and then once absorbing and conquering them, subjugating rebellions as Solomon, as Uwatle had done, turning his sights and ambitions to wars of wealth and conquest, taking on the larger ancestral rivals in history that we would know as Persia, fellow colonists who trace themselves back to Atlantean cults and exiles. Upon the defeat of all known rival neighbor colonies and absorbing their cultures into his own, as well as planting his culture through marriage into their traditional ruling social orders, religious temples, priest classes, warrior castes, and kings, forcing his men to marry the foreign women and forcing the foreign women to marry his men. At this point, he becomes the master of life and death. No longer does he threaten only to kill. The man, the king, Alexander, is obsessed with human life, with society, with art, with marriage, with family. You see here the intrusiveness of who would become known as the God King. No longer was it the external, the praise, the loyalty, the worship, the gifts, the sacrifices. It was the internal, the marriage, the wedding bed, the birth and naming of children. In fact, children had to be shown and be written, recorded, and approved of by the representatives of Alexander's new empire. Alexander literally had control over life and death, symbolically permitting each newborn to live and serve him. This was again a remnant of the former Atlantean eras. This is empire. And the last victory for Alexander the Great as a man was Egypt. Upon defeating the pharaohs, who at this point were the three, or was at one point the southern end, the southern zenith of this solar course, the solar religion, located in their holy cities on the Nile. Alexander was permitted to take the pharaonic crown, the crown of many crowns. It's a crown of 3 crowns. Remember, this is a symbolic crown. It's not a physical crown. It's a symbolic crown of 3 kingdoms, the upper and southern kingdoms. And to crown himself God King, like pharaohs had formerly done. Now made a pharaoh, now made a living god, Alexander the Great left Egypt, deified, not immortal, what's that word called? Infallible. As the popes are now, Alexander the Great, as a deified god king, was infallible. He was not only the supreme ruler of the military, he was not only the supreme ruler of the civic politics and daily decision-making of his empire, he was also the spiritual ruler of his empire. He was now the head priest of the ancient mystery religions. He was now the head priest of the heliocentric religions. And he was now ethically the head priest of the blood religions, the serpent-worshipping religions. Were his original religions, the serpent-worshipping religions, are the religions that conquered all of these. The Macedonian symbol of the Macedonian colonies of Atlantis was that of the ram. And his symbolically created crown was that with ram horns on his head. He would wear this as he led his armies of conquered peoples, mostly from Asia Minor, the Middle East, the Mediterranean, North Africa, the huge armies of mercenaries that he acquired, and marched eastward to explore and conquer, for the first time, mind you, by these Atlantean survivors, what would turn out to be the Indian subcontinent, the middle of Central Asia, the steppes, all the way to Mongolia and China, where he would develop subsequent empires along the way, and eventually end up in Nepal, founding Himalayan Buddhism. That would be the end of the true story of Alexander the Great. We should cover that in its own segment. That would be the archetype that was set up in this occult tradition as the necessary steps to achieve apotheosis as a literal ruler of men, but still a man, into a deified demigod status as a man still living on Earth. Now, if you're following me here, that means that there is, in these occult ancient mystery circles, magical rituals that take not only selective breeding to begin as a prerequisite, but also actions that are scheduled along timelines that synchronize spiritual and physical developments with real-world conquests, all having occult and ritual significance and forms of human sacrifice, sun worship, and the conquest of spiritual centers, as if though it's a game. You can say a Game of Thrones. There would be a few challengers to this throne, but the one that matters the most would be Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar was the exact same as Alexander the Great, born to achieve this apotheosis, conquest, and through this living ritual, go from literally a man to a leader of an empire to a demigod, achieving immortality through the legend of his conquests. And although he still be mortal, his title resurrecting and being immortal as an authority to its own empire and all people in that empire. This is heavy shit. This is heavy, heavy shit. This is actually far more intense in magnitude than simply even taking over the world. You're not only taking over the world, you're taking over as a living god, the head of people's lives in all respects, internally and externally, judging all of their actions by your example of life. In doing so, under the heliocentric empire and banner of Rome, the city in the intersection of this course of sun, a city built, and the intersection between the purely commerce and mercantile aspects of the representation of London and the purely spiritual aspects of the southern tip as well. Now, there is a lot of videos, there are a lot of presentations currently already online explaining the similarities between Jesus Christ and Julius Caesar. So much so that it appears quite obvious to me, upon digesting of all the evidence, that the two were one and the same, and that a secular historical understanding of the man is presented with the life and times of Julius Caesar, and the spiritual, hidden, ancient, occult aspects of his passion, of his life cycle, of his spiritual evolution, is told in metaphor and created very recently, specifically to obfuscate this and to hide this, as well as to create a narrative that's almost completely artificial, that is completely agenda-driven, and completely a hoax, a forgery, to establish the seat of spiritual power to where it specifically never, ever occurred. that of where they say current-day Jerusalem is. And that is not the case. Not at all. Julius Caesar, though, did achieve this apotheosis in much the same way Alexander the Great did, almost identically, through the conquest of Egypt. And he did so, yes, with force, by suppressing rebellions in the manner of King Solomon, but also, unlike Alexander the Great, like Alexander the Great, with marriage to Cleopatra, by marrying into the Ptolemaic line of Pharaoh Ptolemies, the Ptolemy dynasty, at that point, having taken and slain Pompey, his rival, having taken over the Atlantean colony of Gaul, and conquered, enslaved, and forced their forest cult into submission, where later Rome would chase them into the UK, forming Londinium proper, after having burned down the sacred groves of the Druids, after having razed the mounds of Stonehenge, and having suppressed their Pict, Celt, and otherwise various Druidic tribes, rebellions in the form of Boudica, the warrior queen, symbolically raping her daughters, as a subjugation of the female-led Amazon cults of warrior women warlords. And remember, Julius Caesar was just a man, mortal as well. And instead of dying on the cross, as it's represented, died when he was betrayed by the Senate, who, although standing for all virtues and loyalties of the heliocentric cult of Rome, betrayed Julius Caesar for personal profit, for literally silver. Also symbolic, the worship of the moon, night, Isis, and the importance, alchemically, of silver. But in doing so, the blood sacrifice of Julius Caesar did not mitigate and slow the advance or establishment of this new heliocentric monotheism in these extremist eccentric cults of astro-theologians spread out across Europe along its coasts as colonists. His sons immediately took up the title Caesar. And through his lineage, which he had raised, saw his own agenda, saw his own will achieve immortality through a perpetual resurrection. Though he was stricken down, though he had died, literally his son and his heirs as Caesar had him live again, still as demigod status living gods. The Caesarship lasted for almost 800 full years, until the so-called Dark Ages. But in reality, it was the subsequent division of important cities along a shifting heliocentric model. Although temporary, this too lasted for 800 years. From the year 800 AD, in our chronology of understanding, to the year 1600 AD, the heliocentric course that forms the ellipse that looks like a figure 8, the sign of infinity, that the heliocentrics track with the utmost seriousness, drawing their power and authority from it, were surprised, shocked, and scandalized when it shifted 90 degrees and was no longer coursing over London, Rome, and Cairo, but now over Spain, Rome, and Turkey, present-day Turkey. This would see the shifting of the established Roman Empire away from its major city colony, Londinium, in the British Isles, Rome, in central Italy, and Alexandria in Egypt at its southern point to Spain and to where they call Byzantium, which we call Turkey. There you would have the Eastern Roman Empire established in Spain and the Western Roman Empire established in Byzantium. Byzantium would be the spiritual center. And then Spain would be the commercial, economic center. And I believe the third city at this time actually was not Rome in the middle. It shifted itself to Paris. In this time called the Dark Ages, we see the rise of Charlemagne. We see the rise of Paris in France as a central European power. We see Madrid and Barcelona. We see the ravages of war within this 800 years, the arrival and rise of Islam itself, very, very much steeped in the foundations of all of this, like all Abrahamic religions, and through the interpretations and rewriting, through the mystery schools, through alliterations, through the colloquialisms and retellings and expressions of these hidden, suppressed, and censored truths, through genealogies and the life experiences of certain individuals. Muhammad, for example. But even then, modern Islam is also relatively very recent. This would also be heretical according to Islam. And I will tell you that the Crusades never happened. The Crusades never happened for the Middle East, rather. For in fact, at this time we are quickly realizing that there really wasn't the wars of conquest and near death in Europe by Muslims. There was a coexistence for the longest time with these seemingly Middle Eastern, Northern African civilizations as welcome traders, merchants, tourists, scholars. There have been Viking rings found at the year 1000 AD with the transcriptions of Allah, transcribed that Muhammad is his prophet and Allah is the only God. Vikings traded with these people. So, what we're told is a lie. In fact, the Polish history, for example, Lithuanian history, Baltic history, will talk openly how they were allied with Tartars and Muslims, defending their kingdoms from aggressive Catholic or Roman Catholic invasions during this time, as colonies continue to fight colonies. But because the occult rituals had occurred and the specific necessities at a time when the heliocentric course was physically in a different alignment between the years 800 AD and 1600 AD, there could not be a new God Emperor. There could not be the fulfillment of the occult ritual of creating a God Emperor through symbolic conquests to achieve apotheosis as it was traditionally understood in the disciplines of these former Atlantean ancient colonies. But no matter what the common person, the Muggle or the Mudman or whatever, the Goyim that was surviving in their communities, the upper echelons all knew that they all had arrived in very similar circumstances. They all had the same roots. They all could trace their origins back to Atlantis. And that they were all symbolically competing for the throne that required blood and human sacrifice and eventual self-sacrifice. That was based on the model of the Alexander romance itself, based on the symbolic archetype of the Mithric mysteries, the worship of Mithras, an avatar of Apollo. It is at this point, around 1400 in our timeline, that the Holy Roman Empire rules all of Europe. No matter what different kingdoms, from the kingdoms in England to the kingdoms in the far eastern European area to the kingdoms of North Africa, the entire world submitted to the Holy Roman Empire. It had many avatars, many countries that themselves were empires existing within this superpower. The most powerful military, the most powerful war machine, the most powerful infrastructure, navy, technology power, the most powerful merchants and richest business people, banks, etc., were the Spanish Empire. It is not a coincidence that the Spanish sent Christopher Columbus, the Cristo, Columbia, the Christoph of the world, the Christ of the world, the Christ, the anointed of the world, literally what they would call the king of the world, Cristo Rey, Christopher Columbus, with his red-crossed white sails. Remember how important red is, even today in our society. Rothschild, the red shield. An immediate recognition that the red on white is a symbol of power, like the flag of England, or the red and white stripes on the American flag. This red-crossed white-sailed fleet of ships from the symbolically named, fictitious person, by the way, Christopher Columbus. And remember, I told you, if there's an individual, it's the classic Bugs Bunny situation. The individual is not real. The individual is a caricature based on many different inspirations from physical mannerisms of individuals, likenesses, voices, speeches, actions, the many different influences and efforts behind the scenes of the anonymous workers that really make these events happen. You want to think that Christopher Columbus literally did everything himself and found these places against everyone's better judgment. Everyone was doubting that he was going to find America. Everyone said, "Oh, Christopher Columbus, you're crazy." Not the fact that this was an intentional mission with thousands of people participating. People who stayed on the shore and just made sure that they were well supplied and on the books and ledgers and stuff. People who stayed in the New World, quote unquote, and built the colonies, who took life and limb and risk and lived with the natives, etc., etc. People who sailed with him, uncertain if they were going to get paid, for example. Everything is too good to be true, except for the fact they don't want to admit that it was intentional. Because these people in the old world, quote unquote, Europe, they knew full well America's location. They knew full well America's location because it used to be Atlantis. And they came from Atlantis. And though it had been 1,600 years, maybe 2,000 years even by this point, they were coming back. They were coming back in a big way. No longer were they the literal insane mental patients, criminals, exiles, prisoners, traitor, military, pirates, organized crime, religious fanatics, etc., 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 living in prison colonies that they called nations. No, they were coming back after over 1,500 years of technological advancement, of spiritual unification, of experience in governance. And as I posed the question before, if you were a military commander who was stationed in Hawaii, who had control and command of all of the military assets there, how would you conquer your former country after 75% of it had died of disease? After most of it had gone feral, intentionally, philosophically feral, had resorted to living in the forest and hunting ducks with bows and arrows, had resorted to painting their bodies to ward off the disease that killed 3 out of 4 Americans, that cut their hair into mohawks, and were reported to take slaves to cut the hearts out of their enemies and to eat them for their bravery. How would you go about conquering a country as large as America, knowing that most of its cities were completely empty, abandoned in time, filled with wild animals and overgrowth? You only have the people you have. Say you have a few million civilians and a few thousand, tens of thousands, maybe 100,000 or so soldiers. You have ships, you have weapons, you have cannons, you have guns, you have armor, you have helmets, you have all this. You have the knowledge from your former empire. You have your knowledge from your former home. How would you view yourself? As a returning liberator? As someone bringing peace? As someone bringing order? As someone who may be holier, more righteous than the people who may be hostile to your invasion? In your mind, you know you're saving your country. You're saving the world. Even though you may have to kill your former countrymen, your former kinsmen, your former neighbors, your former leaders, to take these cities back, to claim their infrastructure for your new lands, for your new country. You have a date with destiny, and you won't let anyone stop you. And you will rewrite history if it has to happen. You will burn books if you need to. You will exterminate those that will not submit. That is the America, that is the situation that is encountered, that's discovered, quote unquote, discovered. Invaded is more like it. Intentionally invaded is more like it. By the new war machine of the Caesars, who have evolved the Holy Roman Empire from the Khazars to the Catholics, who reign from their city of the dead, Vatica, the goddess of the dead, her city, Vatican City, which was a cemetery city filled with catacombs, and the clergy that performed the rites of the dead were known as the Catholics. From these necromancers came the Catholic Church. And of course, assimilated over time through wars of extermination, every single variant, sect, cult, Gnostic, apocryphal, heretical, blasphemous, different disagreeing philosophy within Europe, persecuting them as witches, lycanthropes, and over time creating in that effort the identity that we would become to know as Jews, who are not ancient people, who have no connection to Jerusalem, but rather united as vagabonds, as outlaws, as refugees from pagans, from various belief systems considered taboo, criminal, or perverse, into a syncretic diaspora based on extreme paranoia, obsession with survival, and a very, very intolerant to outsiders worldview. And in these practices that are syncretic, that have as very many different origins, between bloodletting sacrifices and mixing blood into matzah bread for Passover, to the behavior of their Orthodox rabbis and Talmudists, etc., would see the seed that would eventually rewrite history and be used, exploited to create the unsavory rewriting of the quote-unquote modern version of Abrahamic religions, themselves complete forgeries created around the 17 to 1800s. But this is when they're being created, is through the conquest of all of Europe by the Holy Roman Church. As it goes to conquering America, the conquistadors, who had fought and defeated the Muslims in Spain for 80 generations, were strategic masterminds. They were hard as nails, and they were men devoted to holy war in the name of the Catholic Church. They were led by priests as well as generals. They arrived with the latest of their technology, cannons, metal armor for their horses, halberds and muskets, crossbows. While they were few, they were armed to the teeth, and their ships were undefeatable fortresses with firepower unmatchable by even the most advanced of the natives in the quote-unquote New World. Sounds like what I've described. The militaries returning to reconquer, to save their former lands, now that the old lands are empty, with the old generations now dead. Where there once was an estimated 100 million plus Native Americans, now there is only 25 million Native Americans across all of North America. That's less than the population of Texas, spread out across all 50 states, Canada, and Mexico, as well as the Caribbean and the East Coast from Florida to Maine. The largest population center, ironically, was no longer in the Babylon of the Atlantic coast, or the Mississippi River Delta, or the Ohio Valley. The largest population centers were now located in Florida, along the Gulf Coast of Acapulco, the Gulf of Campeche, and the Caribbean islands, the island of Cuba, for example, Jamaica, etc. This is where, tactically, strategically, not randomly, the Spanish, under orders, began the first phases of conquest, seeking to take out and conquer the most civilized, quote-unquote, the most populated areas first. After taking out the Caribbean and conquering that as basis of operation, after finding Florida to be an exotic and intensely surreal environment, describing it as the fountain of youth, the Spanish would go directly to where they already knew Tenochtitlan / the biblically accurate Jerusalem was, remembering this having already been conquered by the Babylonian military as the center of power to these Mexicanites. When the Spanish arrived under the banner of their Julius Caesar inspired Pope, the Catholic Empire, with its avatars represented as the King and Queen of Spain, specifically Queen Isabella, representing the Isis figure in the trinity of Isis, Ra, the sun god, and Horus, the son of the two. They found the people, though populous, to have devolved into states of primitivism, just like everywhere else, except these people numbered in the millions across the jungles of the Yucatan in South Mexico. These people, though, were very superstitious. These people were governed on the ancient prophecies, omens, and superstitions that many of them could not deviate from. In a masterstroke of psychological warfare, they selected a blonde-haired, blue-eyed general to lead the efforts of negotiations and conquest, not as a violent warlord, but as a representative of their god, Quetzalcoatl, to trigger the genetic memories, tracing itself all the way back to the Noahide priests of Atlantis and Mu. The blonde-haired, blue-eyed Atlantean priests are the Mu priests of the Southwest, who were the sons and children of Noah. This was such a successful tactic that even in conventional history, they say that they allowed Cortez to travel as an honored guest, as they thought he was a living god. They thought he was Quetzalcoatl in the flesh, and his men were angelic. Thought they were from the great beyond. They thought they were from the other world as they came across the horizons on these ships with sails like clouds. That's how much these people have devolved into savagery, into primitivism. Over these 800 years, over this course of years, this has occurred. This is how isolated they are in their jungles. When they bring Cortez to Tenochtitlan, the peoples there are the descendants of the former Babylonian captives who had revoked all of their identity and former marriages, allegiance to the Semitic peoples of the serpent, the peoples of Moses, and have now identified fully since then as people of Babylon, even electing a red-haired king of Babylonian descent, who history will remember as Montezuma. After 800 or so years of idle rule in this large fortress city, still located in the middle of a lake, although no longer able to build or repair or to expand this empire, although no longer able to meet their former standards in the Golden Age, these people are still spiritually the authorities of all the lesser, weaker, smaller tribes. And like Babylonians, ritualistically raid and enslave for intentions of sacrifice these weaker, smaller, primitive tribes, seemingly as sport. Another thing they do is spend most of their time playing what they call the ball game. Played on a black and white court. A symbolic, seemingly impossible to understand, perpetually played series of contests between sports teams involving balls made of leather being thrown or knocked or shot through hoops into nets. You can see the parallels between our society because we have rebuilt it in our Babylonian system, just like how these people had rebuilt it in their Babylonian system. Upon getting close enough and having learned enough of the seemingly childish rulers of what was once Babylon and Mu, it's decided to simply take them prisoner, to hold them hostage, and to force ransom on them until the sizable portions of the army can arrive, secure beachheads, fortify the area, etc., hoping for minimal bloodshed. Remember, these are warriors, these are armies that are directly led by the same tacticians and strategic leaders, war commanders, marshals, centurions, legates, that used to run Rome and its war machine. These are the men who defeated Carthage. These are the men who defeated the Gauls. These are the men who defeated Egypt. These are the men who defeated literally every enemy, from the Moors back through time, from the Greeks to the Etruscans, and various pirate nations. from the Germanics to the Goths. They knew how to suppress a people, how to assimilate a people, and how to do so both violently and non-violently. And showing that Christ was a Lord of mercy, the Caesar was a Lord of mercy, they were going to do so non-violently until the people began fighting amongst themselves, the people of the native, weaker tribes, taking the opportunity to wage vengeance and slaughter back their former oppressors. Now that the power had been redistributed at the hands of these invaders. Montezuma is now being held hostage by the conventional understanding of how the Spanish took over Tenochtitlan, took over the Aztec Empire. 3,000 men or so, in a small group of 300 men, who were led to the city center, were given an audience with the emperor of the Aztecs, Montezuma, who was so childish he could not understand that harm could come to him, for no ruler in his family had ever been harmed. This was how naive they were. Upon these skirmishes beginning outside, Hernando Cortez realizes that they are in danger because the sheer number of people who live inside the city, in the hundreds of thousands, could easily outnumber, swarm them, and kill them to a man within moments if they discovered their location. And if they discovered their location, they would need a miracle. They would need some active religious symbolism and importance to intimidate the literally rioting city of 100,000 plus people. As streets were burning, as men were fighting with swords and knives in the streets in big gangs of hundreds from outsiders and insiders, etc., Cortez takes Montezuma to the top of the Temple Mayor, the former Temple of Solomon. And at the Temple of Mayor's top, in full view of almost all the city that is looking at, and he's getting their attention through horns and trumpets, he ritualistically kills the king of the Aztecs, the king of Tenochtitlan, Montezuma. He ritualistically garrots Montezuma, strangling him to death in the top of the tallest building in Mexico City at the time, a place where 80,000 men had been killed by its creator in 2 days in the former golden age of the city. Now, only one man is sacrificed. Only one man is ritualistically murdered to show to the people that he is no god, that he was an imposter, and that the true God, represented through the avatar, Jesus Christ, of the God Emperor Julius Caesar, as has been promoted and created by the Vatican and the Catholic Church, which has transformed the former Holy Roman Empire of Caesar into the Catholic Empire of the Vatican. They have turned the Caesarship into the Pope, or rather, turned the Popeship, which is the high priest of Rome, from worship of Zeus and the patron gods of Rome to the worship of Caesar, perpetually understood through the life and example, the sacrifice, poetically, symbolically, of Julius Caesar. And it's under the banner of the red cross, red symbolic of Rome, red symbolic of Mars, red symbolic of Atlantis, symbolic of Babylon, symbolic of Lilith, red symbolic of Adam, red symbolic of blood, that the red-haired imposter, faux Babylonian, last ruler of Tenochtitlan is murdered. Having killed and sacrificed this living, quote-unquote, living God, the point is unmistakable, that the new leader of these people, upon pain of death, will be the invaders of Christopher Columbus, of Spain, of the Holy Roman Empire, of the Vatican. And although there are many wars and battles still fought between the native warriors and the many different temples and lodges, both of the city and elsewhere, the conquista of North America becomes inevitable as the war machine of Babylon, converted into the Holy Church of Europe, the colonies of the East, return and systematically attempt to conquer the New World Spain spends the first century from the 1500s into the 1600s, taking over Mexico, taking over South America, taking over the Caribbean. They take over the Incan Empire itself, exactly like how they found the remnants of Mu, the remnants of this former megalithic power, completely beholden to cults of lineages claiming to be living gods. And they systematically conquered the Inca. They systematically conquered the Viracocha. They systematically conquered the peoples of the Amazon. They systematically set up bases, outposts, created nations, created workforces. They did that in record times, in lightning fast time, developing these places, establishing them within decades, and within centuries, developing fully functional nations as colonies across everywhere they had went. They spent a considerable amount of time focusing on the Caribbean, Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, as well as Florida, building up a lot of fortifications around Florida. It was, though, around the 1600s when an event occurred. This event in the 1600s, around 1666, saw the change of the course of the sun, the path of the Helios, return again to its original alignment. Moving back to its original alignment when Rome and Julius Caesar and Alexander the Great first lived, with its intersection of its ellipse being Rome, the Vatican, unchanged, its furthest extent of commerce and mercantile power and war, military, being London, returning back to England, returning back to the UK, and its southern point now landing in Saudi Arabia, where from 1600 onward they would begin to develop Mecca into the modern center, the spiritual center of the East, that based on the Saturn, where they built the Kaaba. These are all much more recent changes than anyone wants to truly admit. And remember, I told you they added 1,000 years to their calendar, and they added it around this time, because it would be in this era between the 1600s and the 1900s that we begin to see the massive rewrite of history, the massive realignment of history, the massive inversion of history from east to west, from west to east, from up to down, from north to south, from south to north, good being evil, evil being good. You see the creation of these false Christ-like figures through the specific elevations of certain peoples into spiritual authorities who'd have their roots, their true position in the mercantile, monetary, commercial castes. I'm talking about the Jews. You see this around the 1600s. Robert Supper talks about the invention of Frankism, aka redemption through sin, a reversal to try to create an anti-Catholic Antichrist as an attempt at destroying the power that the Spanish and the Byzantine Constantinopolitans used to command the Greek Orthodox Church and the Spanish Catholics. You now see British City of London rabbis, Talmudists, philosophers, thinkers of the Enlightenment era, all the way to Karl Marx. Within 300 years, you get Isaac Newton discovering gravity when an apple falls off a tree and hits him in the head. To Alan Turing, the homosexual computer engineer, who helps present the computer age of the 20th century. You go from the fires of London in 1660 to the Battle of the Blitz, the Battle of Britain in the 1930s. You go from King James of Scotland to anarchy in the UK in 300 years. And that's 100% because of the work of King James of Scotland. Because King James of Scotland, these Jewish converts and scholars, they created the King James Version of the Bible. They created the first English mass-produced translations, presumed to be authorities of Abrahamic lineages and religions. And they did not do so immediately, but over time, integrated the dualities of perversion, sin, and satanic exploits through the Judeo-Frankists, Talmudists, and then created the revision history through the supplanting of scholarly authorities via Freemasons. They created the Royal Academy of Sciences. They created the Oxford universities and its many different schools. They created the quote-unquote experts. And they created the many Protestant cults, Christian cults, that would confuse and muddy the waters with extremism, fundamentalism, and outright lunacy, that would thrive not only across Europe, funded by the British Crown as an anti-Catholic operation of international European scale, or World War type scale, but also intentionally told to settle the New World, quote unquote New World, with London, with England's, with the Crown's very own colony, that of the Atlantic seaboard. By this time, the populations of Native Americans were almost completely gone. But even the first settlers in the 1600s of the British colonies reported the discrepancies of the Native Americans being white-skinned and having colored eyes and knowing how to speak English. The Native Americans were not the savage, bloodthirsty lot, as always depicted, but rather quite helpful, recognizing them as relatives and seeing the newcomers as a rightful transition from their failed society to a new era, the ending of the 5th Age and the beginning of the 6th Age, a return to America's date with destiny. The new settlers were astonished to find entire cities, entire towns, farm communities with trails, roads, wine cellars, etc., abandoned and empty, being overgrown by the forests. You can choose to believe the conventional histories, but as conventional histories go, the British had extreme hardships, losing entire populations of the first colonies to the environment alone. Think of Jamestown and the Croatoan. But just like the Spanish counterparts, who the British were actively engaging in warfare with to assert as the supreme empire within empire, as the war machine, as the merchant masters. Then again, there was always the element of Paris in France, the French and British arch enemies. But historically, the Spanish are called the arch enemy. The arch enemy of England are the Spanish, not the French. It's because of the symbolic position within this occult superorder of nations. It is from this colony and from their Anglo-Saxon Protestant cults of the Calvinists of England, the Puritans, and the collection of rogues, specifically these syncretic Frankist Jews, spreading things like the Illuminati in Freemasonry across the American colonies, that eventually there were over 1,500 different self-identified Christian cults in North America, in the American colonies, Canada, with the majority of Spanish lands being 100% Catholic in comparison. It is from these two New World competing religious missions that are two spokes, that are two different empires inside a larger empire of confederated occult nations, that we begin to see the development of the avatar of Jesus Christ into its modern interpretation. Everything from Renaissance art to sculpture to religious tapestries to cult leaders' interpretations of utopic messiahs to the Jews' rewriting of a Jewish Jesus or the rejection of a Jesus based on their Talmudic practices to the fabrication of his birthplace and life, including how many years he lived based on the occult black magic of like Freemasonic practices, where we get the age of 33, for example, that originated both in London and matured in North America. Get the ideas of his relationship with women, for example, in the predominantly homosexual or virginal Enlightenment circles, which would push the image of a celibate Jesus, for example. We get the differences, everything from a blonde-haired, blue-eyed white Jesus of the Americas to the black-skinned Jesus of the black populations. Oh, and by the way, I didn't include that, but in this whole thing, remember, there are indigenous free black nations, tribes, etc., like the Seminole Indians and Cherokee of Georgia and Florida, which resist, which have to be subjugated through violence, which actually go through cycles of war, but prove that they are sophisticated and have language. The Cherokee, for example, are the Cherokee Nation. They have state structure. They have a constitution. They have a written language. There's the Turtle Nations of Tecumseh. Tecumseh was, these were alliances between the red-skinned people, the Adamic peoples of the West, the Semitic peoples, who I described in earlier versions as they moved west, who as they lived in the Atlantic Ocean, Babylonian white-skinned peoples as they were encountered on the East Coast, as well as black-skinned people. These were all considered Native Americans. They were all considered braves. They were all considered, quote-unquote, the red man, the Indian. No matter what their specific tribes, Ojibwa, Lakota, Kiowa, Mohican, whatever, Mohawk, Black Hawk, whatever Indian tribe they were, they could be of any color. They could be black-skinned, white-skinned, or red-skinned. what defined them were their beliefs, their languages, and their territories, where they basically lived. And there was a lot of room to go around, but these people did get into intense wars. The Prince War, Prince Tecumseh War, the Prince Sherman War. These were bloody, bloody wars. These were massive.